Ever wondered what to make with a quilt panel? Well, today we have a free pattern that's going to show you what to do with them, and it's going to work with any traditional size panel. So let me show you this fun quilt. Before we start, make sure to subscribe to our Fat Quarter Shop YouTube channel so you can get lots of free patterns and join me every Friday for live streams. So let's talk about panels. A quilt panel is a large piece of fabric that's printed with a single design instead of a continuous print, and it's usually meant to be the centerpiece of a quilt. Some panels you find at quilt stores are 23 by 42 and some are 1 yard. Today we're going to work with the 23-inch size. Usually a panel's not meant to be cut up into smaller sections, so I'm going to show you how to really showcase this long design. Today we're working with Harvest Wishes by Deb Strain. This panel comes in 2 colors. You can either get it in navy or white, but also I want you to remember any 23-inch panel you have in your stash will work for this. So for this, you just need to download the free Simple Strips panel quilt at Fat Quarter Shop, and then you will need 1 panel, 5/8 yard for the top and bottom, 3/4 yard for the side borders, and then you'll need a binding and a backing. So let's kind of jump right in and start working with the centerpiece and cutting the panel first. So for this pattern, we're going to trim our panel to 22.5 wide by 42-inch tall. So the first thing I want you to do is look at your panel. And we have starched our panel, and as you see, this kind of dips in right here. So anytime you get a panel, it's never going to be cut perfectly. So just try to figure out the shortest side across. And so if I do that, this is 22.5 right here. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and trim this short side where it's dipped first. I'm just going to cut it straight across using the least amount of fabric. So see that dip right there? We're just going to cut there. And we're going to cut straight, and what I'll do is on one side just cut straight at the top. And just use your where you cut as your base. And sometimes you'll have to cut it more than once. And so you can see that straight line. And so you can see it straight all the way across. So now I'm going to turn it around and 22.5 wide. And what I'll do is just do 22.5 with the ruler. So I've got 22.5 right here and just cut. And I'm just going to do that all the way down. Now you could add 2 rulers together to do the same thing, but this is the way you cut a panel with 1 ruler. And just take your time. Now, of course, as you get experience, this will become easier. Okay, so now that I'm cutting, I can see that my panel's not exactly straight right here. It's a little crooked. So I'm going to go back to this side and reline that up and see how it goes a little bit off. Just get it straight again. And you can kind of tell because when you're working on that other side, you'll just kind of be able to tell. And it, you know, this doesn't have to be 100% accurate. Just get it as close as you can. So now that's 22.5 inches wide, and we want to cut it 42 inches across the length. So what I'm going to do is fold it in half. And here I'm going to line up where the top of the panel and the bottom of the panel are. And 42 divided by 2 is 21. So I have it straight up here and I have it straight down here, and I've got an equal amount of space from the top and the bottom. And I need it to be 21 inches wide. So that's just going to give it a tiny bit of room. So what I'm going to do is first cut this one. I'm actually going to cut it wider than I think it needs to be. And I'm lining up the line on my ruler at the top, right there, and at the bottom. And I'm going to cut it a little bit wider and then trim down because it just will be easier to not make a mistake. So I'm cutting it about 1 inch away from the design. It's going to have to be smaller than that, but I'm just going to start here And that's gonna be way too big, but it's a starting point. So this will be 21.5, so that's 43. So I need it to be 42. So I need to cut about 1/2 inch off of each side. So I'm gonna just do that. I'm gonna do it a little bit at a time because I just don't wanna chop anything off that doesn't need to be chopped off. And I'm cutting off a little bit less than 1/2 inch until I get to 42. And there we go. I need to cut off about 1/8 inch. So I'm just gonna cut a tiny bit off. I feel like it's safer to cut panels just a little tiny bit at a time. So I still need about 1/8 inch off. So I'm just gonna cut. I'm lining it up on my mat. And I just need to take a tiny sliver off. And now my panel is 22.5 wide by 42 inch tall, and I've made sure I have at least 1/4 inch here and 1/4 inch here, and all panel designs will be different. Some will have more space at the bottom, some will have more space at the top, so you just kind of have to keep that in your mind when you're cutting and just take your time cutting your panel. Now we've cut our panel, let's move to our borders. So for our top and bottom, we are gonna cut 6 2.5 by width of fabric strips. Now my tip to you is to make sure everything is nice and ironed and no creases, and make sure across the bottom it's nice and straight. So you're gonna put your ruler on the bottom with a line on the ruler on the fold. If you do that, when you unfold your fabric, it should unfold straight. So I'm gonna cut that. Move my fabric where we try not to move it too much, and I need 6 strips that are 2.5 inches wide. So I will cut at the 5 inch and then go back and subcut that down to 2.5. Do the same thing 2 more times so that I will have a total of 6 strips 2.5 inches wide. So I will set the rest of this fabric aside. It's just extra fabric I don't need. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mark each of my strips. I'm not gonna subcut them down. I'm gonna mark them with pins, and then we're gonna mark them with alphabetes. So I need 2 strips that are 26.5. Now you can cut if you would like. I just prefer to knot on big long strips. So 26.5 divided by 2 is 13.25. And I use my mat. 13.25 inches is right here. So I'm gonna mark those at 13.25. And these will be my fabric B's. I'm also gonna mark the center with a pin. Now this is a little bit different way to do it than the pattern shows, and you can try either way, but I think you'll have really nice results with this. So this is my fabric B. So I'm going to put that on a design board and leave that as B. My C's are 30.5 wide, so 30.5 divided by 2 is 15.25. And so I'm going to mark that and mark the center. And so when you open this strip up, it's 30.5 across. I'm just kind of cheating a little bit. These will be my fabric C's. Okay, so my fabric D should be 34.5 wide. So 34.5 divided by 2 is 17.25. So I'm just going to use my mat to mark. And I'll show you why we're marking the center when we assemble the quilt. So these are my fabric D's. So I will put these on my board. Now we're going to move to our side borders. Now our side borders will need to be, we're going to cut 8 strips, and then we're going to sew them end to end and then subcut them. So first, let's cut our side borders. We're going to cut 8 2.5 by width of fabric strips, doing the same method we did earlier. So this fabric, we need 8 strips instead of 6. So to save time, I'm going to fold it in half and cut 2 strips at a time. And when I do that, make sure I have starched my fabric. I want to make sure there's no wrinkles, and I want to make sure that both folds are exactly right on top of each other. So I'll line up my Creative Grits ruler right on that fold. Get a clean cut. You want to make sure you get through all 4 layers, and then I'll rotate that. And I need 8 strips. So there's 4, because there's 2 layers. And you're going to kind of keep these neat, because I'm going to show you what to do before we sew them together. So now what I'm going to do is rotate these, because we're going to join these end to end. And this is my selvage, and that's a pretty thick selvage. I want to get through all of the selvages. So I'm going to put my ruler right here, making sure it's straight, and cut through these selvages. And just make sure you get through all of the layers. So now we're going to join these end to end. And I'm going to show you 2 different ways to do it. I'm going to first just open all my strips. Okay, so you can join these on the diagonal, but today we're going to join them on the straight. And the reason why is we think it looks better on this quilt. So what I'm going to do is just put them right sides together, and I'm going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam straight across. Now if you wanted to sew it as a diagonal, you would attach it this way, sew on the diagonal line right there, and open your seam. But we think it looks better on this quilt straight. So I'm just going to go to the sewing machine, and I'll be right back, and all of these will be sewn together with a straight seam, and I will join all 8 of the strips together. So you've got just a big long chain. What you're going to do is press this seam open. So you'll just press it to one side, and then press all of these seams open. And any of the creases you had from the fold, you also want to get those out. Okay, so I have all of this together in one big long piece. Now I just press my seams open, and on this quilt I'm using a light gray thread colored 2600 Aurifil, because some of my other pieces in the quilt are darker, and I thought my normal light fabric would be too light. So here we're going to do that same thing. For E1, we need 2 42-inch strips. So what I'm going to do is just pick a base, which is right here, and measure at the 21. So 21 plus 21 is 42. And I'm just using the mat for my measurements. And then I'm going to just cut, because I'm going to trim this down later. So this is E1. So I will put this on my board as E1. So I'm going to do that same thing. Now right here, you can see my seam. I'm not trying to make sure that's in the center or anything. I'm just, wherever it lands is where it lands. You could also do this cutting length of fabric if you wanted to. So those are E1. Now for E2, I need 2 46-inch wide strips. So 46 divided by 2 is 23. And so when I get to the 23, that's my center. My E3s are 50-inch strips, so 50 divided by 2 is 25, so I need to mark at the 25. So basically what I'm doing here is just measuring the length that it needs to be and marking it, and marking the center. I'll show you why we're using the center in a little bit, but I trim down later because I want it to be a little bit more accurate. So now I have everything on my design board labeled, and it's going to make it really easy, and just make sure your pins don't come undone, and now we can build our quilt. Of course, if you have any questions on how I'm doing any of this, you can always leave comments in the chat, and I'm happy to answer. So when you go to page 3 of Simple Strips, we're going to first add E1 to the sides of the panel, and then we're going to add B to the top and bottom. Now I'm going to show you how to do that step by step, and then you're going to do that same step for middle borders and outer borders. So I'm going to show you inner borders. So E1 we're going to add first. So you're going to take your panel, fold it in half, and you're going to mark the center. And again, we're adding E1 to the side first. So you'll find your strip and you'll find your center and match up the center pins. Go to the end and match up the pin with the end on both sides. And then you're just going to make sure the edges are all straight together. So from the back, you shouldn't see the front, and from the front, you shouldn't see the back. And just pin so that it doesn't move too much when you are sewing. I always feel like I get a better result the more pins I have. So I added the left side, now I'm gonna add the right side. Doing the same thing, matching the centers, matching the end, and easing in the fabric. The fabric should just lay flat. So now that I have both of these on, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to start past the panel. So instead of starting right here, I'm going to start way out here and stitch. That way any of the ugly stitches that come with the beginning kind of get chopped off. And at the end, I'm going to go all the way to the end and I'm going to sew both sides. So now that I have that sewn, I'm going to set my seam nice and flat all the way across. If you set your seam like this, it will be less wavy when you press away from the panel. Now throughout this quilt, you're going to press away from the panel. If you put the edge of your iron right on that seam, it's going to come out really nice. And you can see it's not wavy. So from here, what I'm going to do is take my ruler, put the crease right on that seam, and trim. And that's going to give you a perfect 90-degree angle. And if you had already cut your strips and then added, it would be a little bit wavy here. So that is why I cut after. Just makes it a little bit nicer. And then I'm going to go to my pattern and I'm going to add my fabric B's, doing the same exact method where I fold it in half to find the center. And even though this is a smaller seam, I still find the center. Now, if you're a new quilter, you might want to just slap these on, but if you do that and you don't measure, I can guarantee everything will get just, maybe not on this round, but by the 3rd round, everything will be wavy. So I do think it's important to try this method instead of just sewing strips on, because I guarantee this will give you a little bit better result. It will take more time, but it will be more accurate. Now when I go sew, I'm going to start that same thing where I start sewing out here and end out here on both sides. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to place my ruler and line up both sides and trim here and trim right here. And you'll get a little tiny piece at the top off, but that keeps it at 90 degrees if you do that each time. Now that is an extra step, but it will give you nice results. And it also gets all the thread off. So this is how it looks. At this point, now we're going to add E2 and C, and I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do the same exact method I did earlier. So now I've finished page 3, and we're going to move to our outer borders, and that's going to be fabrics E3 and fabric D. And what I want you to see is how straight it is across, and it's not wavy. So we're just going to add the outer borders. Okay, so here's how my panel looks, all finished. This is a great beginner project. And remember, you can do all type of themes with this. You could do baby panels, Christmas panels, any type of panels. And another thing you can do is if you want it to be larger, you can just keep adding borders to it. And when you start sewing, you'll get used to cutting your panel, and if your panel is slightly off size, you'll get used to adjusting your sizes on the edges. But I wanted to show you how to do it today using exact measurements, and now I'm going to show you 2 different quilts so you can see different motif ideas for your quilts. So here's another one that's done exactly the same way, and we had our long arm quilter put pumpkins on it. And one thing we also did is we did a dark binding because that kind of brings out the darkness of the panel on the inside. And this design is kind of a log cabin-ish feel. And now I'm going to show you a panel that's lighter. Now here's a lighter panel, and this one just has some vines. So a little bit different quilting, just for some different ideas. We also put a dark binding on this one, and this quilt, we kind of did a courthouse step design to add our borders. We hope you enjoyed this easy quilt panel pattern. We've always wanted to do one on this channel, and I think this one's going to be really popular. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.